All right. How you doing, Dane? This is Dane Wigington of GeoEngineeringWatch.org, and we're going to be talking to him today about chemtrails and solar reflection and trying to explain a little bit about what this is for the people who really don't get it yet. You want to explain a little bit, Dane?
Well, many people, again, have heard non-science terms in regard to what's happening in our skies. Most people have heard of weather modification. Most people understand weather modification is real, ongoing, but they're used to seeing the small prop-driven Cessna planes with some silver iodide flares strapped to the wings. Those are not climate engineering programs. We have massively, unimaginably larger global climate engineering programs that have been going on for some 70 years. We have the documentation to back this up. And so this supersedes and really negates all the localized weather modification programs because they're much, much larger. The science terms are very important if you want to introduce people to this issue, because if they have the science terms, they'll find their way to science fact and not intentionally distributed false information with non-science terms like chemtrails. The chemtrails term leads people straight to conspiracy theory and hoax, and that's what the power structure wants. So terms like climate engineering, geoengineering, solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, those are the science terms. Even just the simple term climate engineering or geoengineering, those two terms can lead to a mountain of science data. And what this involves, Rahasya, is the power structure has always wanted any means of power they could ever get. We all know that. And what greater source of covert power could one have than to be able to manipulate the weather? You can bring a country to its knees without ever firing a shot. And in fact, that's what they've been doing for many, many decades. And the population as a whole is still largely unaware of it. And we need to change this fact. So the major components that these programs involved is to, one, saturate the atmosphere with light scattering, electrically conductive, unimaginably small nanoparticulates. We have patents, about 160 patents for climate engineering that go back all the way to, some go back even to the late 20s and 30s, but the majority, of course, in the most recent decades. But these patents call for various processes of solar radiation management. That's a very primary component of geoengineering. And the stated goal for solar radiation management is to try to slow down the greenhouse effect that's happening on the planet, the buildup of greenhouse gases, by distributing light scattering particles all over the globe in the atmosphere to try to deflect some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. And in fact, for your listeners, that's how I became aware of these programs, because I have a background in solar power. I'm a former Bechtel Power employee. I worked on some of the first commercial solar plants in the continental US. I have a large off-grid home that was the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine in Northern California, is where my home is. And when I began to lose massive amounts of my solar uptake from whatever these aircraft were leaving behind, I knew that could not be condensation. I was losing on some days 60, 70, even 80% of my solar power uptake from whatever these aircraft were leaving behind. So that's the purpose of solar radiation management, to block the sun. And the climate engineers, the military industrial complex, never takes into account the consequences for whatever they're doing. So they've created a situation that's scientifically termed global dimming. And from science study, we know that 20 to 30% of the sun's direct rays don't reach the planet anymore. Rahasya, how many truly blue days do you see lately?
Not many. They're mostly silver.
There you go. And this is indicative of the particles that are in the atmosphere. And we're not guessing that these particles are there, because we've done about 70 lab tests in Shasta, Siskiyou counties in Northern California. We have lab tests from other counties, other places around the globe. But the amount of toxic heavy metals, which are primary ingredients in climate engineering patents, that's coming down in our breathable air column is unimaginable. So we're breathing what they're spraying. It's contaminated in virtually everything on the ground. And for people to understand the totality of effect from saturating the atmosphere with these particles, it radically disrupts the hydrological cycle, the rain cycle. It destroys the ozone layer. We have unimaginably intense UV radiation bombarding us now. It contaminates soils and waters. And again, the the other spin-off effects from those three elements is unimaginable. So we're talking about the military-industrial complex literally playing God with the weather. Why? Because they can. And for those people who say, why would they do this? I would respond, why wouldn't they do this? Why would we expect them to sit around and ask our permission to manipulate Earth's systems in a way that gives them more power and control? Did they ask our permission when they detonated all the nuclear bombs in the South Pacific? No, they don't ask permission. They just do it because they can. So in a nutshell, again, this is the attempt to manipulate Earth's life support systems. And I think we can all understand the unimaginable dangers that come with that.
So here's a question for you, Dane. Let's say this started out as a scientific theory with even the best of intentions. One, they would have to keep doing this, what, forever? And two, I don't think they can afford this, or we can't afford it. So something tells me that greed has entered into the equation.
Greed is always at the core of the equation, in fact, greed and lust for power. As far as them doing this forever, that's what the geoengineering proposals entail. They state this over and over. Though they don't admit the programs are going on, you have the entire climate science community who's bought and paid for at this point from the power structure, the same people that print the money, the same people that run militaries, the same people that own countries. So the science community is telling us that if we geoengineer, as if we're not already, we can never stop. Now, that alone should be a red flag of the insanity of these programs. How can you start something that you can never stop when you can clearly not spray the skies all over the globe with thousands of jet aircraft every day forever? How can you possibly do that? So what we create is, in addition to the massive environmental cataclysms that I already started to outline, you have what's called scientifically double catastrophe scenario, which is what happens, because this is already a scientifically studied scenario. What happens when you start to geoengineer, you load energy into the system, you destroy many of the natural protections and processes of the system, and then you stop. What happens? Cataclysm happens. Why would we expect otherwise? And so the climate science community tries to tell us that we can never stop once we start. That's like telling a heroin addict withdrawal is too intense, so you have to keep taking larger doses forever. That's about the same level of insanity we're dealing with. If we're to have any chance of long-term survival, the human race, the web of life, life on Earth as a whole, climate engineering must be stopped. And I'm not insinuating that that's our only problem at all. The human race has been unimaginably horrific stewards of the planet. But climate engineering, mathematically, is the single greatest assault against the environment, against the web of life, against human health ever launched by the human race. Some have termed it a climate Manhattan Project. And in fact, that's what it is. So the bottom line is, this is something the public absolutely must wake up to. Every breath we take is laden with toxic particles, aluminum, barium, strontium. Aluminum, by the way, is the primary element named in numerous climate engineering patents. And the stated goal of the climate engineers on the record is to dump 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates into the atmosphere annually. Imagine that. And we all get to breathe it. And the smaller the particle, people would ask this too, Rahashia, if they're doing this, how come the public protection agencies like air quality and EPA aren't sounding the alarm? Because those agencies are literally paid to hide the threat, not to disclose it. So the particles we're talking about in the nanoparticulate range, perhaps 50 nanometers per particle, are exponentially, unimaginably smaller than any particle size that's tested by air quality testing equipment, which is PM10 or PM2.5, 10 microns or 2.5 microns. So all this contamination goes under the radar. In addition, the entire system has been set up not to show this contamination. And we know this because we have a team of attorneys, including the top water quality specialist in the state that's working with us, trying to lay out a strategy that will make it through the hurdles that have been set up by the power structure to try to ensure that they can't be sued over this. So this has been laid out for a very long time, and the gravity of what we're talking about here, Rahashia, the immensity, the danger, the lethality, is unimaginable. None of us can breathe without sucking in these materials. They're bioavailable, they're bioaccumulative, they're building up in our systems, and we're all on borrowed time at this point if we can't stop these programs.
Well, next I'd like to talk to you about the people that are starting to speak out, like the pilots, some of the scientists and researchers. So
regarding your question about those involved with these programs, pilots, National Weather Service personnel, NOAA personnel, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, what are we hearing from them? And if we're not hearing from them, why not? First, we are hearing from some pilots, not pilots who are directly involved with the programs, because we certainly know that anyone directly involved would have had to have signed an agreement of confidentiality, which is unimaginably draconian and binding. And in fact, any who wish to see some input on that can watch a presentation with former CIA officer Kevin Shipp. If they search geoengineering Kevin Shipp, they'll see a former CIA officer describe exactly what happens to a person who has signed a condition of confidentiality and then tries to break that. Their careers are ruined, their lives are ruined, and if they continue, worse still. So it's no wonder we don't hear from the pilots that are directly involved or other personnel that are directly involved, but we are hearing from commercial pilots, former military pilots. I recently was contacted by two separate Gulfstream, the private jet pilots, and they fly some pretty elite people around the globe. And they were extremely alarmed when they contacted me because recently, on a number of occasions, they've had to descend from altitudes of above 40,000 feet because the temperatures outside were about 35 degrees hotter than they had ever seen before. And that warmer air did not have the density to hold that aircraft up. So the alarms went off. They had to descend. They're alarmed, and they should be alarmed because the atmosphere is being treated like a giant physics lab. Because in addition to the toxic particulates, which I mentioned, those particulates are manipulated with massively powerful radio frequency transmissions. Those are microwave transmissions. What happens when you microwave the atmosphere that's laden with heavy metals? What happens when you throw a piece of foil in your microwave oven and turn it on? Nothing good. Why would we expect otherwise with the atmosphere? So the climate engineers, in order to steer the jet stream, are intentionally heating portions of the atmosphere to create high and low pressure zones, which spin clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere. They can steer the jet stream in this manner. So again, back to people speaking out. We have some private pilots speaking out. We have an former air traffic controller. I just posted a long letter from yesterday who she's starting to speak out. We haven't disclosed that identity yet. So we do have people speaking out. I'm communicating with a former U.S. Air Force Major General who knows about these programs now, was not directly involved. Again, compartmentalization. That's what we have throughout the whole military. So we have some good men and women in the U.S. military. I hope they wake up, and I hope they start paying attention to the oath that they took to protect the Constitution, their citizens from all threats, foreign and domestic. But they're being told what they're doing is something for the greater good. Just like the pilot that flew in Vietnam, spraying his comrade on the ground with Agent Orange, was being told it was for the greater good. That couldn't be further from the truth. So we don't have those pilots stepping out now. On the National Weather Service and NOAA employees, again, there's a federal gag order on all government scientists and employees, both in those agencies. So not only do those government employees in the National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, not only do they have no First Amendment protection to begin with, they now have a federal gag order against them. So it's no wonder we don't have a line of whistleblowers. And I think many people now know, Rahasya, I know you know, that the current administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined. I know you know that the mass surveillance listens to everything every one of us says. So the police state has laid the groundwork for trying to lock down this giant secret that's glaring in front of us. But people simply need to look up and need to do some research and understand you can't have what we've been trained to believe is a condensation trail. And common sense and reason should tell us we can't have a grid pattern one day and nothing the next. Common sense should tell us we can't see a trail coming clear across the horizon that just stops in midair, and then a jet moves on with nothing behind it. And the bottom line is this: the greatest lie ever perpetrated on populations around the globe is the condensation trail lie, because all commercial aircraft and all military tankers have what's called a high bypass turbofan jet engine. It's a jet-powered fan. 85% of the air that moves through that engine is non-combusted by design. It's nearly incapable of creating any condensation trail except under the rarest and most extreme circumstances. So the bottom line is, when we see any bright trail, even if it is relatively short-lived, it's still a particulate dispersion, period.
Right. Yeah, you know, I have a friend that he tracks the legitimate flight paths of commercial airliners, and he showed me where some of these chemtrail or aerial disbursement programs are simply not.
I don't mean to be phobic about that term at all. I know what you mean. So.
Yeah, they're simply not happening. And plus, when there's nothing in the air, what do people think? That they had no commercial flights that day?
Well, this is where the conditioning of society is so astounding, that people have literally turned off their sense of reason and simply believe whatever they're told, no matter how contrary that propaganda is to common sense. So the gravity, again, of what's happening in our skies, they're being sprayed with, some of these tankers carry 60 to 80 tons of toxic material. Can you imagine how much material it takes to block the sun over the entire horizon, enough to lose 80% of your solar power uptake? That's unimaginable. And again, the particles at altitude, any particle, doesn't matter whether it's from a volcano or the back of a jet, creates a molecular reaction, a chlorine molecular reaction that destroys ozone. So we have a former NASA aeronautics engineer that's working directly for us. We've supplied him with very expensive metering equipment, and he is unimaginably alarmed at the UV levels he is seeing. And I don't even want to mention on the air the time frame he gives us if this current destruction continues. It's shockingly short, because we are right now, today, this is not off on the horizon, it's here. And we are getting not only about 10 times more UVB than we're being told by official agencies. We're getting about 50% of incoming UV is UVB. It's supposed to be 5%. That's 10 times more. But we're also getting UVC on the surface, and that's the last band of UV radiation before X-ray. I think we all know how bad X-rays are for us. So we're being bombarded with lethal levels, DNA damaging levels of UV radiation right now, direct result of climate engineering. Drought in California. I recognize I lectured on climate change, global warming, before I focused everything on climate engineering. So I'm very familiar with the other anthropogenic sources of damage to the climate. And there are countless sources, and that issue is very real. But geoengineering, though it's been sold as a mitigation for global warming, it's actually helping to fuel the fire. So we are told, whenever we have, for example, the droughts in California, in some cases, some factors can be tied completely, almost completely, to climate engineering, and the protracted droughts are one of those factors, because a warming planet rains more. It must rain more because the atmosphere carries 7% more moisture for every degree of warming Fahrenheit. You have to have more rain on a warming planet, but we don't. In fact, atmospheric relative humidity has gone down. In spite of the planet warming radically, it's gone down since 1945. How can that happen? Because you have an atmosphere full of light scattering, sunlight blocking, desiccant materials that absorb and accrete all available moisture, slow down evaporation, because it not only blocks the sun, and blocking direct sunlight affects evaporation radically, because direct sunlight is the greatest causal factor. You need light photons to release the water molecules. But it also stops convection, which reduces wind, which also reduces evaporation. So you have less rain, because the rain is picked up over the oceans, but over the land, these desiccant materials are absorbing moisture, sucking it out of the foliage, and creating even drier conditions over land. So the droughts, and if somebody wants to learn more in depth about this, if they just search geoengineering drought, they'll find lots of data on this. It's not scientifically disputed. So In the case of some things like droughts and the wildfires that result from the droughts, we can most directly attribute that to climate engineering. And when I say that again, I'm not in any way doubting or negating the other anthropogenic sources of damage to the planet, but I'm simply saying, mathematically speaking, the single greatest factor, if we look at all the peripheral negatives from climate engineering, the single greatest climate disrupting factor right now is climate engineering. About your question, Rasia, on these programs of climate engineering, solar radiation management being used against us, against populations, there is absolutely no question that's going on now, not just against opposing powers to the U.S., but against the U.S. population, period. We have more than enough data to know that. In fact, I posted today on the engineered snowstorm that was just parked directly over the top of the Dakota protesters. Now, many people might hear that and think this is preposterous. Nobody can engineer a snowstorm. And to those people, I would say if you lived 100 years ago and someone told you you could talk on a box to the other side of the world and hold it in your hand, they would lock you up. The fact is that technology absolutely exists to engineer a snowstorm. And the same people that might deny that have no trouble believing that a single prop Cessna with a few flares strapped to the wing could change the weather, but somehow they don't believe hundreds or thousands of military tankers dumping unimaginable amounts of material in the atmosphere, bombarding it with radio frequencies. They somehow doubt that that can change the atmosphere. So that's just denial. That's simply bias and denial. Regarding engineering a snowstorm, to those who have any question, again, I don't want anybody to believe me. I never ask anyone to believe what I'm saying. I ask them to investigate. The Chinese government openly announced they were engineering snowstorms. Even Fox News covered this. And anyone can find it online if they search Chinese scientists engineer snowstorms. So if the Chinese government can do it in decades past, they did $1 billion worth of damage to Beijing, by the way. The chemical nucleation turns what should have been rainfall into snowfall, heavy, wet, concrete-like flakes that do immense damage. So if Beijing could do it, if China could do it in decades past, do we really think that our military hasn't been doing it for a very long time already? And since they can steer the jet stream, they can park moisture over a particular region, which they did. And they buried the Dakota protesters, they just did, in record snowfall. Now, let's look at another comparison and say, is this just a coincidence? The 2011 Occupy Wall Street scenario. Is it just a coincidence that a freak October snowstorm also put record snowfall directly on top of them? Is that just an accident? I don't think so. And we even have, let's go back further. Let's go back to Woodstock. If people search Woodstock weather warfare, they'll find that there were some very articulate people there that had recognized the cloud seeding aircraft overhead that washed that event out. And we know they can do this because in the same era as Woodstock, we had Project Popeye in Vietnam. Project Popeye is historical record. The cloud seeding to create rain over the Ho Chi Minh Trail was so successful that by 1978, the UN banned weather modification for wartime purposes. They never banned it over a country's own population. So this is all hard fact. And again, for those people who think that they can ignore this issue, and I know there's many challenges we face, countless challenges, and people think that they're going to elect this official or that president and somehow have a change. We have a system that's corrupt from bottom to top. And the system knows this is going on. The people in the system know, but their paycheck and pension depends on them not addressing this issue. And I know this firsthand. I've been in Lieutenant Governor Newsom's office, private meetings with him and his aides. I've had private high-level EPA meetings in Sacramento, spoken in front of the California Energy Commission, Barbara Boxer's office, congressman. I've made the rounds. I've been at this for 15 years. And what I was just told by a congressional aide in Sacramento was, quote, I'm quoting verbatim, "We all know it's going on. We don't know what to do." And that's where we're at. Everybody's pretending that this is not happening while the planet is torn apart, while Earth's life support systems are torn apart, and while the ship goes down. We have people in agencies that have not shown the courage to stand up and make their voice heard because there's no place to hide. For people who think that they can avoid this issue and not be targeted by the mass surveillance and just hide in the corners somewhere, if you think that whatever you're doing is going to save you from a ship that's sinking, which is the entire planet, you're in for a rude awakening.
Well, this brings us to an interesting point because a while back I wrote an article and the front page said, "Humans evolve when challenged." And you said something to me the other day that really made me start to think, because I like to look at the financial thing, the broken government. There's all kinds of things happening on the planet, the water supply, the food supply, the GMOs, but nothing affects everybody like this does. And if this was actually uncovered on a global level, this really truly could be the galvanizing aspect to collectively wake this planet up to what's going on.
Yes, about your question of this being the most dire, immediate threat we face, the most galvanizing issue that affects everybody who is alive on this planet, you're absolutely correct. In fact, mathematically speaking, we can say with certainty that the greatest and most immediate threat faced by the human race and the web of life is climate engineering, short of nuclear cataclysm. We recognize that obviously could supersede climate engineering at any point in time, but short of that, because we are literally, or the programs, those behind the programs are literally tearing Earth's life support systems apart. And that's triggering countless feedback mechanisms that are also being worsened by other forms of anthropogenic damage. We put 100 million tons of CO2 in the air every single day. We're chopping down the forests, we're paving the planet, we're poisoning the oceans. Those are all huge factors. But if we look at the total saturation from climate engineering, the shredding of the ozone layer, for example, starts to trigger many other mechanisms. That intense UV radiation, for example, is killing plankton. Plankton can't take that radiation. They have to feed near the surface and they're being cooked. So plankton populations globally are now down 50 to 60%. Anywhere from 60 to 80%, depending on the study you look at, of Earth's oxygen content is produced by plankton. Plankton are dying, global oxygen content is crashing. We have forests, boreal forests, that produce the second largest source of oxygen on the planet. Boreal forests are crashing around the globe. Back to the drought, back to climate engineering causing the drought. A warming planet would normally rain more. Even though it's warmer, forests would thrive. They suck up more CO2. They start to help the Earth regain its energy balance. Now we have Earth in a straitjacket, a climate engineering straitjacket. So we're getting less rain. We're getting bioavailable toxic materials saturating root systems, which causes the tree to stop nutrient uptake, starts to die a slow death. We have UV radiation from geoengineering that's frying the trees from the top down. We have, again, less rain, and we have more lightning because we have an electrically conductive atmosphere because of all the metallic particles. And we have an incendiary dust. These metals are incendiaries, and they settle down in the foliage of the trees. So we have, from so many directions, the forests burning down all over the globe can be attributed to such a large degree to climate engineering. And I'm not, when people think dichotomously, they think I'm blaming everything on one factor. I'm not doing that. But I'm saying mathematically, it's the greatest factor, period. So now we have the forest not producing oxygen. And that starts to trigger all sorts of other feedback mechanisms. The soot from the forests starts to settle down on ice deposits in the Arctic and Greenland, turning the ice dark. Now the ice absorbs even more radiant heat, melting even faster. We have ocean temperatures now going through the roof, which is releasing methane. Very important, releasing methane from the sea floor. That methane's migrating into the atmosphere and covering the planet like a layer of glass right now. It's happening right now. And climate engineering is making all of it worse, not better. So although they can engineer short-term toxic cool downs, as I just described, it happened over the protesters in Dakota, Occupy Wall Street. If you remember, Rahasya, remember the snow records in Boston in 2014? Remember all the media about the record snow in Boston?
Yep.
So it's a public perception. It's a way to confuse the population as to the true state of the climate. When they can create those headlines, the people that don't want to believe it's warming to begin with decide that, in fact, it must not be, even though it's 80 degrees in California in January and there's no snow in the Sierras. They look at the snow in Boston and think everything must be fine. So it's a psychological weapon as well. But the bottom line is, for all these factors and all these weather anomalies that are created in this environmental destruction, is hurting everybody, everyone, everywhere, as you correctly stated. And if this is not the most galvanizing issue, if people really understand what's going on, then nothing is, because this is a fight for life. And aside from all the environmental cataclysm I just named, every breath we take is laden with these particles, and our lab tests prove that. Massive amounts of heavy metals that are the primary elements in climate engineering patents are raining down in our precipitation, which means they're in our breathable air column, which means we're inhaling them. And every human test subject we test, hair, blood, urine, are off the charts in these metals. It's affecting all of us.
Well,
so this is literally a fight for life. And if we could expose this issue, it would be a paradigm shift.
Well, you're definitely doing your part, Dane. I remember 6 years ago you came to my house telling me about the methane expulsion, the Upper Siberian Shelf. So you've been way ahead of the curve all of this time. So I really hope that this will help wake a lot of people up, because we need to start paying attention. We all breathe the same air. We all want our kids to grow up in a healthy climate. And I think this truly is one of the worst things happening on the planet right now. So I really appreciate your time.
I would agree. And
if people want to...
If I could make one last...
Sure, go ahead.
I'm sorry I want to answer for people the question of what can I do? Because that's the bottom line. When people hear news this dire, they've been programmed to feel helpless, and that's
Right.
a mistake, because everyone has a tremendous amount of power in this equation if they would simply choose to use it, to learn how to effectively pass on information on this issue. And if we woke people up to this issue, they would wake up to everything else. They would wake up to the medical industrial complex, deception on vaccinations, and 1,000 other issues. They would wake up because they would know just how far the train is off the tracks, if you will. But on this issue, if you arm yourself with credible data and you learn how to convey that data without putting up people's alarms and just getting them to investigate the issue, if everyone everywhere would help to wake those up around them, those in their circles, so that eventually in some of these circles you're going to have military personnel whose families are forced to wake up to what their military family member is doing or involved with. And if all of us begin to wake those up around us, again, mathematically speaking, it becomes exponential extremely quickly, and we reach critical mass extremely quickly. And once we reach critical mass, once military families, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, once they know what they're involved with, they're killing their own family, they're killing their own planet, I would argue at that point we kill these programs from the inside out. So at GeoEngineeringWatch.org, we don't sell anything. Our site is simply a data repository, a tool for people to use, and you can download flyers from that site for free, print them locally. Very powerful flyer, color, glossy, visual, two-sided. For example, if a person has that with them, you can pass it on without a long oral dissertation. You don't alarm people. You just simply tell them to investigate, and you would be amazed how fast you wake people up, because most people are realizing something's radically wrong with the weather. So what I would say to people is, don't underestimate your power. Arm yourself with some data to keep with you. Learn how to share it. Help us sound the alarm. Help us reach critical mass. If we can reach critical mass, we can stop these programs.
Sounds like a good plan, Dane. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahasha.